Should we hold your kid hostage to the crazy foreign policy of this country, or just rich kids?
This week in Common Sense for the last week of October and the first week of November 2019. And the issue this week has been the draft.
Yes, two commentaries on the draft. And you know, as regular readers of Common Sense and viewers of these videos will know that we've talked a lot about this national commission that Congress set up to look into whether we should have forced national service for young people, heaven forbid, whether draft registration should be expanded to include women, which the courts are going to require that there be equal protection of the laws. So they either expand it to women or they have to get rid of it for everyone, which of course is what they should do for all kinds of reasons. And if you go to thisiscommonsense.com, there's a pull down menu on the draft. There's a ton of information about the draft and draft registration and national service and so on. But Elliot Ackerman, who I do not know, but I know his father pretty well because his father's a very interesting guy, was on the board of directors of U.S. term limits back in the 90s, and co-wrote a book on strategic nonviolent conflict, which is just hits the nail on the head in terms of, you know, if you don't believe in violence to make the world better, what do you believe in? How do we get free in Hong Kong, in Catalonia, in Russia, in China, in the United States of America, unless we can strategically engage our governments nonviolently and change them? So Peter Ackerman's a fascinating guy. And of course, Elliot Ackerman was a Silver Star winner in Iraq, in the Marine Corps, fought in Afghanistan and won the Bronze Star, and unfortunately got a Purple Heart, and has written a number of books. Very, very thoughtful, well-educated, bright guy. And he wrote a piece in Time that, in a sense, is pretty crazy and and doesn't make any sense to me. But it's kind of like his heart was in the right place, sort of, because he's looking for how we get a handle on our foreign policy, how citizens might be able to control it. Now, his solution is that we conscript people into the military so that the public is more, hyper concerned. Oh my goodness, this could happen to my kid. It seems to me that we ought to be able to be concerned about war and peace, even without someone holding a gun to our kid's head. And if our government is so out of control that we are so worried, why would we hand them our kids as cannon fodder on a silver platter? But in this modern time, when of course we're supposed to hate people who are wealthy and who have, amassed some wealth in this world, his idea is we only draft the children of parents in the top income tax bracket, the top income tax, or the top income earners. And now, obviously, it fails if you apply the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause to it. It's a terrible idea to pick out one group in society. That's why it's forbidden constitutionally. But it's interesting because he's saying, hey, the only way we can get a handle on our Congress and our White House and our military is that's under civilian control, but doesn't seem to be under citizen control, is to put the wealthy and the influential in jeopardy. And in essence, to hold their kids hostage. Wouldn't be enough, I guess, to hold middle-class parents hostage, kids hostage. We've got to hold the wealthy folks. We get a better ransom. The truth is, I'm not so sure that changes the political dynamic a lot. because of course they're going to have different views on what war is good or not so good, and they're going to be both Democrats and Republicans, and I don't think it changes the dynamic. I think he is right about we have a problem that our government's out of control. And when your government polices the entire globe and is out of control, there's a lot more opportunity for problems. But as I said in my Friday commentary, if you do just a quick arithmetic and look at the 30 years, it's roughly 30 years after World War II ended, that we had a peacetime draft. Well, we had Korea and we had Vietnam, both wars in which tens of thousands of soldiers were killed, American soldiers. And I don't think that commanders said, oh, we don't care about life. But I think that manpower was easier to get. And that does have an impact. And if you look at the 45 years since roughly, I guess it's 46, since 1973 and the draft ended. And of course, when they ended the draft, there were still drafted people in the Army finishing their tour. So you could almost argue it, probably 75 before it was a completely all volunteer Army. But anyway, I don't know the exact date. But the interesting thing is less than in that 30 years, you had Korea and Vietnam, you had over 90,000 American soldiers killed in overseas wars. And in the 45 years after the draft was ended, we've had less than 10,000 people killed. And so even though it's, I think, ridiculous and terrible that any American soldier would be killed in Afghanistan today as that war just drags on and on and on, and they are being killed still, it's very small numbers. And I think that is, at least in large part, an effect of an all-volunteer force, to where if you get involved in an unpopular war, you can't just hire and hire and hire, because people can say, you know what, I'm not walking into the recruiting station. And that makes a world of difference. It is putting a marketplace check on the way we conduct military operations around the world. And I think that that's a wonderful thing. It is sort of sad that we can continue to police the world as much as we can, because I don't think that that's the right thing to do. And I don't think it's what the American people want. So it's kind of sad that we're able to continue to do it. But this idea that if somehow we had a draft, the resistance would stop it, it's like these people saw a movie about Vietnam or something, and they didn't quite, the movie was only 90 minutes, and so they just thought everything happened real quick, and there was a draft, and then they didn't like the draft and the war ended. That's not what happened. What happened is you had years and years of people being conscripted into the military against their will to go fight and die, and many of them fighting and dying. And you had people resisting and going to prison and their lives being turned upside down. You had the ability to carry on a war that didn't have public support because the manpower was just coming in by fiat and by force and by jailing people who didn't show up. And so you really had a situation in which, yes, I think resistance had a big impact. Resistance to the draft had a big impact in ending the Vietnam War. I don't think there's any question about it. But in a sense, the Vietnam War ended the draft before the draft ended the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War ended in 1975. The draft ended in 73. So it was the experience of Vietnam that caused the public to say, get rid of the draft, before the public was ready to say, we've had enough of Vietnam. So, this idea that somehow to stop the war machine, if that's, and I'm using that loosely, I think sometimes it is a war machine, and I think other times, it's not. It's a peace and freedom and let's restore sanity machine. But I think too often it's a war machine. And if your view is that we're fighting and intervening and mucking up way too many places, the idea that giving politicians enough trust to start drafting, conscripting your kids and altering their whole life plan, and that somehow that's going to be a limit on politicians is just absurd. But people are looking for something, and we do, I sympathize because I'm looking for something too. I don't think our foreign policy gets thought through by the public because they're never encouraged to think through. Everything's, there's so much, as we've talked about before, so much secrecy about everything. Oh, we just can't know because they won't let us know. And there is this bias in the media that we've talked about many, many times, and we're going to talk about it one more time at least because it's worth talking about. Donald Trump has been popular across every television network in this country one time, and that's when he bombed Syria, because he accused them, and all the intelligence agencies said, hey, they use chemical weapons. Now, if you look at the reporting since then, there's plenty of evidence that maybe it wasn't Assad's government that used the chemical weapons. So but the media, what's his name? I'm going to forget his name. Darn, the communist is how I know him. Vance Jones. He, at one point in his life, may still said he was a communist. And
Van Jones.
Van Jones. What did I say?
Vance.
Yeah. I was giving him extra letters. But he came out and said, Trump looks presidential. And I don't see Van Jones as like a big hawk, but all of a sudden Trump is presidential. And so we have this constant push. And of course, there's billions and billions and hundreds of billions of dollars at stake, and over time, trillions of dollars in all the contracts and all that we're doing around the world militarily and otherwise. And so, of course, there's a built-in constituency for that. But I think the American public is completely shut out of foreign policy. We don't have any check on our government there, and we're desperately looking for some check. And I think it's a bad enough situation that I could easily, if Tulsi Gabbard got the Democratic Party nomination, I could see myself voting for, even disagreeing with, I've got to disagree with 80 to 85% of her policy positions. But on the one issue that nobody seems to raise very often, Trump sort of has and sort of hasn't. It's been kind of a mixed bag. But one of the most refreshing things about Trump is the idea that maybe somebody would question whether we need to be in Syria or wherever. Not always excited about how he goes about things, but that's been refreshing. But she's the only one on the Democratic side who is speaking forcefully to that issue about regime change wars and constant fighting and militarism around the world. And I'd be very interested to see her do well and give people some alternative. And it would be interesting, Hillary Clinton has alleged that she might be a Russian, asset and all this different crap. But it would be interesting to see her run as a third party if she doesn't get the Democratic nomination, because I think there are not a ton of people who, so many people are locked into the red team's the devil, the blue team's the devil. And so they're going to vote for the other team. But I think she might pull a lot of votes because she would be the only candidate speaking forcefully to our foreign policy around the world of constant ongoing regime change, where even the peace candidate, Mr. Obama, comes in with the idea of getting out of Iraq and out of Afghanistan. And not only are we in both countries still, but decides to go topple Gaddafi in Libya. Just an insane play, and then intervenes in Syria and intervenes in a feckless way. But I wouldn't have intervened at all. And so, it has been under Republican, Democrat, the peace candidate, as much as the war candidate, that we have had a foreign policy of we'll knock over any government anytime we feel like it. And people may not remember, but one of the things that I still sticks in my craw about Obama and the Libyan foray is that he purposely, it seems to have been purposely, that happened. Everybody knew about it. It's not like it wasn't in the papers. But under the War Powers Act, which I see as a congressional giveaway of power to the executive branch, but the executive branch has grown so arrogant with its power to make war whenever it wants, sees the War Powers Act as some sort of restriction on their power. And Obama had to, within 30 days, 60 days, I don't have the exact number, but it legally has to report to Congress, maybe 90 days, within that period, and specifically waited until a few days after the deadline to inform Congress about it. Now, you know what kind of reporting we'd get on that if Mr. Trump was doing it. And well, we should get reporting saying what is going on here, because he's not fulfilling what legally he's supposed to fulfill, but hardly a peep about Obama doing the same thing. And so this idea of we do whatever we darn well please, and not only Congress be damned, but most of all the public doesn't even get to discuss the issue. That's got to change, and that's why, even though Tulsi Gabbard is a big government person, it would be interesting to see someone running for president, and to have a president who would question even more forcefully the military-industrial complex and the foreign policy of we'll do whatever we want around the world, police, and also regime change.
You alluded to being informed about what the president is doing in foreign policy matters. The Congress, there was a long wait time, a lag for Obama, but Pelosi and company were objecting the very next day that they hadn't been informed on time. So that's a rather interesting double standard. Is that not possible?
Well, I mean, if there weren't for double standards, there wouldn't be any standards in Washington. So, it's interesting because and part of me kind of says it's good for a president to be sharing that his authority and so on. That's how you build a better government and so on. And so in that way, I think you could certainly make the argument he sure should have let them know, and in a timely basis. Now, there was a lot about Russia was told, but not Democrats in the Congress. And of course, that's because Democrats in the Congress don't have any territory that they hold militarily that we had to fly over, and Russia does. So, but the other part of that is that Washington leaks horribly, and I'm glad about a lot of those leaks. And anybody who's listened and read knows I'm glad about a lot of those leaks, because I want to know what the government's doing, and I think they're way too secretive. But at the same time, those, like right now, they've been holding the impeachment inquiry behind closed doors and selectively leaking things, so that it's if you're getting information, that's good, but if you're only getting selected parts of the information, that's bad. And the media goes along with that, and of course makes sense. They're trying to get information, they're trying to get the scoop and publish it. That's what we want them to do. But it when the media is partisan, it creates a very interesting situation. And I think that the price, if I were to calculate the price Trump is going to pay for not informing the Democrats, it will be exactly zero.
Mr. Elliot Ackerman has an interesting idea politically, or maybe it's not. Instead of tax the rich, it's conscript the rich. Does this have any play, you think, for Democrats, or is this is that his idea here, or what's going on? It seems weird.
Well, this idea, and I think this part of it, I think he's a very sophisticated guy. He knows this is going nowhere, and that it can't constitutionally, I think, go anywhere. But I think there's a lot of people who like the idea. I think that while I look at it and I think that's a really offensive thing to suggest, and I don't think it was trying to be offensive, but it offends me when some part, including rich people, if a rich person is a rich, bad, evil person, then don't like them because they're bad and evil, and not because they're rich. And if they got rich because they did bad, evil things, well, then they don't deserve to be rich, of course, and you can dislike them all you want. But this idea that somehow people who have more are bad and we can just take their stuff or take their kids, that's not a healthy thing for society. And it's never been, the whole class warfare angle has never really worked very well politically. But I see again and again talk about income inequality. I've started to write something several times about all the different protests around the world, because there have been a number of stories in Washington Post, other places, about the protests. And there are protests in Chile, where they raised the transportation fees, and protests in Catalonia, where they put people in jail for holding a referendum about separating from Spain. They've got the protests in Hong Kong about encroaching, Chinese totalitarianism on what's supposed to be two systems for at least a few more years before totalitarianism takes over. There's been these different things going on in Iraq. We've saved Iraq. Well, Iraq's there's hundreds of people who've been killed by the soldiers there. Is that the U.S.? I mean, we do seem to be behind their government, and their government's killing people in the streets. So, but there doesn't seem to be any news about it as if we have any role, and it seems like we do. But I digress. But all of these different protests, the way it's been kind of framed is it's anger at inequality, income inequality, and political hopelessness combined. And I think that that's just complete bunk. Just complete bunk. Like, for instance, in Chile, or Chile, I never can say it right anymore. It's like for years I had it down, and now it's like I never can. I'm so terrible. But anyway, but there it is all kind of economic, but they're not mad because some people can afford the fare and they can't. They're not mad because rich people get cheaper fares. They're mad because the fares are going up and they can't afford to do it. So it is anger at economic circumstances, which of course are tied to political circumstances, but I don't know where you get the income inequality. I don't think the problem in the United States is income inequality. I think when someone is angry that they don't have what they think they should have, you can always then point to someone who's got something and try to blame them, but you want a system in which you can get that, not where you can steal it from somebody else. So, I just think, and again, it's the media creating the narrative. In other words, they're not bringing us the news. They have their narrative that they spin every day, and then they stick in the news where it fits the narrative, and if it doesn't quite fit it, then they shave off a little bit and make it somehow fit. And you look at Hong Kong, there's not one bit of angst in Hong Kong about income inequality in terms of the protests. They're not there like, don't extradite us to that totalitarian, hellhole, complete civil liberties devoid country, China. And we really think some people have more money than they should, and we should get some of that. That's not what the chants are. And so this whole idea, or Spain, income inequality, Catalonia's the wealthiest area in Spain. So they're not protesting income inequality. They're saying we want our own culture, our own language, and frankly, being ignorant of a lot of their history until reading something a few weeks ago, I didn't really have kind of the full knowledge of, they've gone through a bunch of stuff under Franco clamping down on speaking their language and customs and other things. And we see this in China with the Uyghurs and in Tibet and so on, where folks are just, it's ethnic cleansing in a sense. Part of it is brutal ethnic cleansing, but part of it is also a little less brutal brainwashing ethnic cleansing in a sense, trying to destroy somebody's culture. And the truth is that happened in the United States with the Indians to a degree. That's what the law is saying, that that you couldn't teach slaves to read and write. And I think there were laws after slavery ended that you couldn't teach Black Americans to read and write. What was that about? That's about where we want to destroy your culture. And it's just, it seems to me that the world, we look at some of these different places and we're not getting better. It's getting scarier. And it's not as if I look to the United States to solve all of these problems, but I think we do, I think we have served some good purposes in the past, mainly by being an example. And I think we've really failed in the last few decades, even more. I mean, we failed other times. Vietnam was a failure in terms of being on the wrong side in a war, and not that the other side was so wonderful, but when there's a war, and we should learn this, when there's a war where no side is right, that's a good war to skip and wait for another war to come along. And so I think we have set a poor example, and I think we've made it easier for folks to look at China and say, well, maybe that's not such a bad deal. Can't really trust the U.S. We can't, and those things I think make a difference. I go back to Reagan's tear down this wall. It was easy, I think, to look at the U.S. and look at all the terrible, dumb, sometimes evil things that we've done throughout our history, in invading countries when we shouldn't have, and in fixing intelligence to be able to, for the Gulf of Tonkin or for whatever. But when Reagan pointed out, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, it was stark and it was clear. And I think that statement was gigantic historically. And it shows that, it seems sometimes kind of trite that, well, the good guys will win the hearts and minds, but the truth is wars are won by hearts and minds, and it's worth winning them. And it seems like that so often our foreign policy is about somebody making a buck, or some deal somewhere, and not about winning hearts and minds. And I think the American people, we've got no dog in the fight of which product some country's going to buy or not buy. We want them to buy American products, but we're not waking up every morning going, we got to invade some country to open up some new market. That's not how American free enterprise works. And so we have to, it seems to me, get some handle on our government, because outside our borders, they don't behave like we want them to behave, and that's a serious problem. Yeah, a lot of times, it's hidden. We hear about some court case years after the fact, but there's blowback when we do stupid things around the world, and we're a lot better country than that.
One thing Ackerman doesn't mention in his desire to conscript people, to get people to change their ideas on what we should be doing overseas, that rather bizarre chain of logic, which I've heard before. It's not the first time we've heard this.
No.
But one thing it doesn't mention is the fact that the military is going as fast as they can to drone warfare. And the future is not with grunts on the ground. And so really conscripts probably in the future won't be on the ground. They'll be behind a booth somewhere on the other side of the planet pushing joysticks.
Well, and that's so much of it has. That's exactly right. And And it's why also the whole idea of drafting a bunch of people into the military, it's like they watched too many World War II movies, and it seemed like such a great time. And you know, if you were a young person who went from the rural farm somewhere in Kansas, and next thing you're in Tokyo, and then you're here, and you come home and you're a hero. And I mean, and I'm here. Look, I'm a kid born 15 years after the end of the war, and I watched those movies, and you know, and I'm inspired by what we did, and we stormed the beaches, and you know, it's easy to kind of think we need to restore that sort of, you know, that sort of patriotism and togetherness, and it's like, be careful what you wish for. We don't want to repeat World War II. We don't want to have to conscript young people and change all their lives. You know, the goal of our government shouldn't be to give us these incredible experiences of the world nearly toppling over, but to give us very calm experiences, if that's what we want, where we live our own life, and where if we want a whole lot of excitement in our life, we got to figure out how to have that excitement. We got to find our own roller coaster. You're not providing it for us. You know, it does seem to me that there's a lot of that. We need something big, you know, and the Green New Deal, they're always talking about, it's like a new Marshall Plan or bigger than the Marshall Plan. It's like we need a World War II attitude or something. This is ridiculous. And the truth is, one of the things that years ago I did I got into some of the different jazz tunes of the 30s and 40s, especially during the war, and I got into some of the different speeches. I made a little tape for my dad, who was very into history and World War II and stuff. And one of the things that I found amazing was how calm FDR and Churchill were. And part of that calmness was that they did have real confidence. They were a lot bigger than Germany. I mean, in other words, they understood that strategically they're positioned in a much better, they're going to win the war. I mean, when Churchill's saying, we'll fight them on the beaches, and he's not just, hey, I'll just wing it and hope for the best. He knew that the British Empire was a pretty big thing, and they had America there, you know, in the wings and so on. We don't want our leaders to be running around all the time saying the sky is falling and we need to change everything. Government needs to take over all the industries because, and somehow that if we have to get rid of all fossil fuel jobs and create all these new ones, no big deal. It'll be better. You'll love it. I mean, this is insanity. And yet it's talked about as if you don't agree, you must be sticking your head in the sand. So I think any idea that starts with, hey, this will be like World War II or some other catastrophe, because that's what World War II was. It was a catastrophe that ended ended, thank God, and ended better than it could have, but a catastrophe. No thanks. This is commonsense.com, Monday through Friday, every day a daily commentary, some common sense about something, hopefully, and on the weekend a video, Saturday and Sunday. So no day does a person in America have to wake up without common sense.